Laughter ricocheted off the cold tin walls of the prisoner of war camp, sharp and hollow, like stones flung at metal. 15 German women, their gray coats thin against the early winter wind, circled the sealed American ration boxes with something between curiosity and scorn. One voice cut through the rest, high and biting. "That's dog food." The laughter that followed shattered like glass, brittle and bright. Private James Collins stopped mid-step. The December wind bit at his neck, and the American flag patch on his shoulder fluttered once. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply set the boxes down cans of beef stew, hard crackers, cocoa powder, and turned away. Behind him, the laughter chased like shadows. Night fell. The guard lights glowed tired and yellow through the mist. Frost crept through the gaps in the pine-scented wooden walls. Hunger was not loud. It was a hand that wrapped around the stomach. Squeezed, then squeezed again. Helga, a nurse who had once believed in victory, stared at the canned goods as if they were enemies. The lid popped. Steam rose, carrying the scent of meat and carrots, touching a memory. An evening before the campaigns, her mother's stew seasoned with nutmeg. She tasted. The spoon clinked softly against the tin, trembling. No one laughed. Another prisoner extended her hand. "Nur ein bisschen." Just a little. And then more hands followed. The sound of spoons scraping replaced the echo of pride. Dawn came. When James returned, the empty cans stood in neat rows like soldiers at inspection. Helga stood straight, her throat dry and raw. "Thank you." He nodded once. At the edge of the dirt yard, a flag and an empty can both trembled slightly in the wind, silent, but heavy enough to soften what remained of war in the human heart. The camp sat 40 miles west of Frankfurt, nestled in a valley where the November fog clung to everything like wet wool. It had been a labor depot during the war, then a holding facility for displaced persons, and finally, by late 1945, a prisoner of war camp for women. Most had been auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, radio operators captured in the final chaotic weeks as the Reich collapsed. The barracks were drafty but structurally sound. The wire fences were not electrified. The guards were young American soldiers who carried rifles but rarely raised their voices. Inside, the women lived under a rigid schedule. Wake at 6. Roll call at 6:30. Breakfast when available at 7. Work details at 8. Laundry, kitchen duties, minor repairs, lunch at noon. Free time until 4. Dinner at 5. Lights out at 9. The rhythm was military, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. What was not predictable was the food, or rather, the lack of it. The supply lines across Europe were still tangled. Rail tracks had been bombed. Roads were cratered. Winter came early that year, and with it, shortages. The camp's German rations stored before the surrender had dwindled to nothing. The American supplies that replaced them were irregular at best. Some weeks brought surplus. Others brought apologies. Helga Schneider was 26 years old, though she looked older. Her hair, once a soft blonde, had darkened with grime and stress. Her hands were steady, trained by 2 years of field medicine. She had set bones in trenches, stitched wounds under candlelight, held dying men while they whispered for their mothers. She had been efficient. She had been necessary. And when Berlin fell, she had been captured while trying to evacuate a makeshift hospital in the city's eastern sector. Now she scrubbed laundry in cold water and tried to ignore the gnawing ache in her ribs. Helga had pride. It was a small, hard thing, like a stone she carried in her chest. It kept her upright. It kept her silent. It kept her from begging. When the other prisoners complained about the food, she said nothing. When they whispered about the Americans, how they chewed gum like cows, how they spoke too loudly, how they had no culture, she listened and did not disagree. She did not need to. The evidence was everywhere. Take the rations, for instance. The American soldiers brought boxes stamped with English words and strange logos. Inside were cans of meat that did not resemble any cut Helga knew. There were crackers that crumbled into dust, There were bars of chocolate so sweet they made her teeth ache. There were packets of powdered eggs that smelled faintly of chemicals. To Helga, raised on black bread and pork roast and her grandmother's apple strudel, it was not food. It was industrial waste, packaged for convenience rather than nourishment. And so, when the boxes arrived that gray December morning, the laughter came easily. Private James Collins was 22 years old, though he carried himself like someone older. He was tall and lean, with a face that had not yet learned to hide what he felt. His hands were rough from farm work before the war. He had spent his summers hauling hay in Pennsylvania. His sister had been the smart one, the one who read books and wrote letters and dreamed of teaching. She had died in a bombing raid over London in 1944, killed while volunteering with a relief organization. James had enlisted 3 days after receiving the telegram. He did not talk about her. He did not talk about much at all. At the camp, he was known as quiet but fair. He followed orders. He did not fraternize. He did not look the other way when rules were broken, but he also did not enforce them with cruelty. When he distributed rations, he counted carefully, making sure each prisoner received the same amount. When he stood guard, he did so without commentary. The other soldiers called him preacher because he carried a small Bible in his coat pocket, though he never quoted from it. James had been there the morning the rations arrived. He had watched the women gather around the boxes. He had heard the laughter, sharp and mocking. He had seen Helga's face angular and pale, her eyes bright with something that was not quite humor. He had heard the words, "That's dog food." He had said nothing. He had simply set the boxes down and walked away. Later, in the guard shack, another soldier, a corporal from Ohio, asked him why he did not push back. "They're prisoners," the corporal said. "You don't have to take that." James cleaned his rifle in slow, deliberate motions. "They're hungry," he said. The corporal shrugged. Still, James did not answer. He was thinking about his sister, about the last letter she had sent, written in her careful cursive. "Do not let this war turn you into something you are not." He had carried that letter through France, through Germany, through the long weeks of occupation. He carried it still. The prejudice was mutual, though it wore different faces. The German women believed the Americans were uncultured, unsophisticated, lacking in refinement. They spoke of this often, in the barracks, after lights out, when the darkness made honesty easier. One woman, a former secretary from Munich, described a dinner she had attended in Berlin before the war, where the courses were served with precision, and the wine was older than anyone at the table. Another, a teacher from Hamburg, recounted how her students had memorized Goethe and Schiller, how they had understood beauty and discipline. The implication was clear. Americans understood neither. Helga did not join these conversations, but she did not object to them either. She lay in her bunk, staring at the wooden slats above her, and thought about the rations, about how the cans were labeled in English, which she could read but found graceless, about how the food inside looked like something scraped from a factory floor, about how the soldiers who distributed it did so with the blank efficiency of men who had never known hunger. She was wrong, of course, but she did not know that yet. James, for his part, did not think much about the prejudice. He noticed it, he would have been blind not to, but he did not dwell on it. He had seen too much to be surprised by human cruelty or pride. What surprised him was the laughter. Not because it was unkind, war had taught him that people could be unkind, but because it was so fragile. It sounded like something that would break under the slightest pressure, and pressure was coming. The supplies that week were delayed. A snowstorm had closed the main road from the depot, and the backup route was impassable. The camp commander, a captain from Virginia with a thin mustache and a fondness for procedure, announced that rations would be cut by half until the road cleared. The German prisoners would receive 1 meal per day, supplemented by whatever remained in storage. What remained was very little. By the 3rd day, the kitchen served a watery soup made from onions and carrots. There was no bread, there was no meat. There was only the soup, thin and pale, served in dented metal bowls. The women ate in silence. Some cried, others stared at nothing. Helga finished her bowl and felt hungrier than before. That night, lying in her bunk, she heard the sounds of the camp settling into sleep, the creak of wood, the rustle of blankets, the soft coughing of women who had colds they could not shake, and beneath it all, the low, insistent growl of stomachs. Her own stomach ached. It was not the sharp pain of injury, but the dull, grinding discomfort of emptiness. She pressed a hand to her abdomen and tried to ignore it. She thought about the rations, the cans of beef stew that the women had mocked. She thought about the laughter. She thought about how easy it had been to scorn something she did not need. Now she needed it. The realization was bitter, like metal on the tongue. On the fourth day, the snow stopped, but the road did not clear. The soup was thinner. One woman fainted during roll call and had to be carried to the infirmary. Another began to cry and could not stop. Helga moved through the day mechanically, her body operating on instinct. She washed clothes in water, so cold it burned her hands. She folded blankets that smelled of mildew. She avoided eye contact with the other prisoners because she did not want to see her own hunger reflected back. That evening, after dinner if it could be called, that she returned to the barracks and found a box on her bunk. Inside were 3 cans: beef stew, green beans, and peaches in syrup. There was also a small packet of crackers and a bar of chocolate. She stared at the box for a long time. The other women gathered around, murmuring. One reached for a can, then pulled back as if burned. Another laughed, but the sound was thin and unconvincing. "Still dog food?" someone asked. No one answered. Helga picked up the can of beef stew. It was cold and heavy in her hands. The label showed a picture of a steaming bowl, bright and absurd. She turned the can over, studying the writing. Ingredients: beef, water, carrots, potatoes, tomato paste, salt, spices. It was not elegant. It was not refined. But it was food. She found the can opener, a small, crude tool provided by the guards, and fit it to the lid. The metal resisted, then gave with a soft pop. The smell hit her immediately. Rich, fatty, unmistakably meat. Her mouth watered. Her stomach clenched. She did not wait for a spoon. She drank from the can, the warm liquid sliding down her throat, the chunks of beef and carrot catching on her teeth. It was salty. It was greasy. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She thought of her mother's kitchen, of Sunday dinners after church, of the way her father would close his eyes when he ate, savoring each bite. She thought of the last meal she had eaten in Berlin, a piece of dry bread shared with another nurse while the city burned outside. She thought of all the meals she would never eat again, and all the meals she might still have. And then she cried. The other women did not laugh. They watched in silence as Helga set the can down, her hands shaking. One by one, they reached for their own cans. The sound of metal lids popping filled the barracks like a strange broken music. Spoons clinked, mouths chewed. No one spoke. When the cans were empty, the women washed them in the basin by the door. They dried them with their sleeves. They stacked them in neat rows by the wall, as if returning something borrowed. Helga lay in her bunk that night with a full stomach for the first time in days. The ache was gone, replaced by a different kind of discomfort. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. She had been wrong. She had laughed at something she did not understand. She had scorned a kindness she did not deserve. She thought about the soldier who had brought the boxes, the quiet one with the serious face. She did not know his name. She had never asked. She had barely looked at him. She would look now. Morning came cold and clear. Frost covered the ground in a thin white crust that crunched underfoot. Helga rose before wake-up call and dressed in the dim light. She gathered the empty cans, 15 in total, and carried them outside. Private Collins was standing near the gate, his breath misting in the cold air. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression unreadable. Helga stopped a few feet away. She held out the cans, clean and stacked. "Thank you," she said. Her English was halting, accented, but clear. James looked at the cans, then at her. He nodded once. "You're welcome," he said. They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them filled with things neither could say. Then Helga turned and walked back to the barracks. James watched her go. In his chest, Something shifted, a small, fragile thing, like ice cracking on a river. He thought about his sister, about the last time he had seen her, standing on the porch of their house in Pennsylvania, waving as he left for basic training. She had made him promise to write. She had made him promise to come home. He had kept the first promise. The second had been taken from him. But standing there, holding a stack of empty cans in the early morning light, he felt something close to peace. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was simply the recognition that the person standing before him, the enemy, the prisoner, the other, was also human, and that was enough. The inspection came without warning. A staff sergeant from headquarters arrived with a clipboard and a scowl, demanding to see the records, the inventory, the duty rosters. The camp commander scrambled to comply, barking orders at the junior officers, who in turn barked orders at the enlisted men. James found himself standing at attention in the supply shed, watching as the sergeant counted cans and checked expiration dates. "You been handing out extra rations?" the sergeant asked, not looking up. "No, sir," James said. "Standard distribution." "Uh-huh." The sergeant made a note on his clipboard. "You know the regs, Collins. Prisoners get what they get. No more, no less." "Yes, sir." "Good." The sergeant closed the clipboard with a snap. "Because I hear you've been soft on these krauts." "That true?" James kept his face neutral. "I follow orders, sir. See that you do." The sergeant leaned in, his voice dropping. "War's over, Collins. But that doesn't mean we're friends. You remember that?" "Yes, sir." The sergeant left. James stood alone in the shed, surrounded by boxes and cans and the smell of dust. He thought about the word soft, about what it meant to be hard, about whether kindness was a weakness or a choice. He thought about his sister, who had chosen to help strangers in a foreign city and died for it. He thought about the empty cans, stacked and clean. He thought about the woman Helga and the way she had looked at him that morning, her eyes clear and direct. He made his choice. That afternoon, during the distribution, James added an extra can to each ration. Not much, just a small tin of fruit or vegetables, something to supplement the meal. He did not announce it. He simply placed the cans in the boxes and handed them out as usual. The prisoners noticed. They said nothing, but their eyes spoke. One woman older, with gray streaks in her hair, touched his arm as she took her box. "Dank," she whispered. James nodded. He did not smile. He did not need to. Later, in the guard shack, the corporal from Ohio asked him what he was doing. "You heard the sergeant," the corporal said. "No extra rations." "They're not extra," James said. "They're regulation. That's not what the inventory says." James looked at him. "Then the inventory's wrong." The corporal studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're going to get yourself in trouble, preacher." "Maybe," James said. "But not today." The next crisis came 2 days later. A prisoner collapsed during work detail, her body crumpling like paper. The other women screamed for help. James was nearby, inspecting a fence line. He ran. The woman, a clerk from Dresden, barely 20, was unconscious, her skin pale and clammy. James knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was weak, but steady. He looked around. The nearest medical officer was in the main compound, 10 minutes away by foot. Protocol said to wait. Protocol said not to intervene. James ignored protocol. He lifted the woman in his arms and carried her to the infirmary. She was light, too light, her body fragile as a bird's. Helga was there, sorting bandages. She looked up, startled, then moved quickly. "Set her down," Helga said, gesturing to a cot. Her English was better now, practiced over weeks of necessity. James laid the woman down gently. Helga leaned over her, checking her eyes, her pulse, her breathing. "Hunger," she said, her voice tight and cold. "She needs food, something warm." James hesitated. The infirmary was out of rations. The kitchen was locked until dinner. He could requisition supplies, but that would take time, and the woman did not have time. He made another choice. He went to the supply shed and opened a box. He took a can of soup chicken noodle, according to the label, and a packet of cocoa. He returned to the infirmary and handed them to Helga. "Heat this," he said. "Make her drink it." Helga stared at the cans, then at him. "This is not allowed," she said. "I know. You will be punished. Probably." Helga held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. She took the cans and went to work. James stood by the door, watching as Helga heated the soup over a small kerosene burner. The smell filled the room, warm and savory. The woman on the cot stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Helga knelt beside her and spooned the soup into her mouth, slowly, carefully. The woman swallowed, then swallowed again. Color began to return to her cheeks. Helga mixed the cocoa with hot water and brought the cup to the woman's lips. Steam rose, carrying the scent of chocolate and sugar. The woman drank, her hands trembling as they wrapped around the cup. Helga looked up at James. Their eyes met across the small room. No words passed between them, but something did an understanding, fragile and new, like the first shoots of green after winter. "Thank you," Helga said again. This time, the words carried weight. James nodded. He left before the medical officer arrived. The report was filed the next morning. Private James Collins had violated supply protocols by distributing unauthorized rations to a prisoner. The camp commander reviewed the report, frowned, and called James into his office. "You know why you're here?" the commander asked. "Yes, sir." "You know what you did wrong?" "Yes, sir." The commander leaned back in his chair, studying James. "Explain it to me." James chose his words carefully. "A prisoner collapsed. She needed medical attention. I provided what was available. What was available was a medical officer. The medical officer was 10 minutes away, sir. She didn't have 10 minutes. So you took it upon yourself to play doctor?" "No, sir. I took it upon myself to keep her alive." The commander sighed. He rubbed his temples, looking suddenly very tired. "Collins, I understand what you're trying to do. I do. But we have rules for a reason. We can't have every enlisted man deciding which rules apply and which don't. With respect, sir, the rules don't say to let people die." "No," the commander agreed. "They don't." He tapped the report with one finger. "I'm going to put a note in your file. A warning. Next time, you follow protocol. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Dismissed. James saluted and left. Outside, the sky was the color of old steel, heavy with the promise of more snow. He walked back to his post, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He thought about the report, about the warning, about the consequences that might still come. He thought about the woman in the infirmary, alive and drinking cocoa. He thought about the balance between duty and compassion, and where the line between them blurred. He thought about his sister, and he hoped she would be proud. 5 years later, the world had shifted again. Germany was divided, rebuilt, and scarred. The prisoner of war camps were gone, replaced by refugee centers and reconstruction offices. James Collins was no longer a soldier. He worked for a civilian relief organization, coordinating supply shipments to cities still recovering from the war. The work was bureaucratic and slow, but it mattered. It felt like something his sister would have done. He was in Hamburg when he saw her. She was crossing a plaza near the docks, wearing a nurse's uniform and carrying a medical bag. Her hair was longer now, pinned back in a neat bun. She looked healthier, less brittle, though her face still carried the same seriousness he remembered. James called her name before he could think better of it. "Helga!" She stopped, turned. Her eyes widened in recognition. They stood facing each other across the cobblestones, the distance between them filled with 5 years and 1,000 unspoken things. "Private Collins," Helga said, her English smooth now, almost unaccented. "Just James," he said. "I'm not a soldier anymore, nor am I a prisoner." They smiled, tentative and small. They found a cafe nearby and sat by the window. The coffee was real, strong and bitter, not the ersatz powder they had known during the war. James ordered 2 cups, Helga added sugar to hers, stirring slowly. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Relief work," James said. "Shipping supplies mostly. Food, medicine, building materials." Helga nodded. "I am a nurse again. At the hospital near the port. We treat dock workers, refugees. Anyone who needs help." "That's good," James said. "That's really good." They talked for an hour, the conversation moving carefully around the past. Helga told him about the camp closing, about the long train ride home, about finding her mother alive in the rubble of their old neighborhood. James told her about leaving the army, about taking the job with the relief organization, about the letters he still wrote to his mother every week. Eventually, Helga asked the question that had lingered between them. "Why did you do it?" "At the camp. The extra rations. The soup. You could have been court-martialed." James looked at his coffee. "I had a sister," he said. "She died during the war. She always told me not to let the war change who I was." He paused. "I think she meant not to let it make me cruel." Helga was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was cruel. At the beginning. I laughed at you. At the food. I thought I was better." "You were hungry," James said. "We all were. Hunger is not an excuse for cruelty." "No," James agreed. "But it's a reason." He looked at her. "We survived. Helga. Both of us. That's something." She nodded. "Yes, it is." Before they parted, Helga reached into her bag and pulled out a small tin can. It was empty. The label faded but still readable. U.S. Army beef stew. "I kept this," she said. "To remember." James smiled. "Remember what?" "That pride is a poor substitute for kindness." She handed him the can. "And that sometimes the people we think are our enemies are just people trying to survive." James took the can, turning it over in his hands. "I'll keep it too," he said. They shook hands, a firm, honest grip. Then Helga left, walking back toward the hospital, her medical bag swinging at her side. James sat alone in the cafe, holding the empty can. Outside, the city moved around him, trucks and bicycles, workers and children, the slow, grinding machinery of rebuilding. The war was over. The camps were closed. The prisoners were free. But the lessons remained. Years later, Helga would stand in front of a classroom of nursing students in Berlin and tell them this story. She would tell them about the camp, about the laughter, about the night she opened a can of American rations and cried. She would tell them about the soldier who risked his career to keep a woman alive. She would tell them that medicine was not just about skill or knowledge, but about seeing the humanity in every person, even the ones you have been taught to hate. The students would listen, some skeptical, some moved. One would raise her hand and ask, "But how do you forgive? After everything?" And Helga would say, "You start by accepting kindness, even when it comes in a can you do not recognize." James, for his part, kept the can on his desk for the rest of his life. It sat next to a photograph of his sister and a letter from his mother, written in 1946, when he told her what he had done at the camp. The letter said simply, "Your sister would be proud. I am proud. Keep being who you are." He had kept it, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but he had tried. On his last night, many years later, in a hospital room in Pennsylvania, he asked his daughter to bring him the can. She did, placing it gently in his hands. He held it, his fingers tracing the faded label. "What is it, Dad?" she asked. "A reminder," he said, "that we are not defined by the worst things we do, but by the best things we choose." She did not understand, but she nodded. And when he passed, she kept the can. It sits on her mantel now, next to his medals, and his Bible, and the photograph of his sister. Visitors sometimes ask about it, and she tells them the story as her father told it to her, about a camp in Germany, about hungry women and a quiet soldier, about laughter that turned to tears, and pride that turned to gratitude, about a can of beef stew that became a lesson in humanity. The story ends the way it began, with an empty can and a flag trembling in the wind. But now, the can is not a symbol of scorn. It is a symbol of survival, of the small, stubborn acts of kindness that persist even in the coldest, cruelest places, of the understanding that we are all, in the end, just people trying to eat, to live, to be seen. The flag still waves, the can still sits, empty but not forgotten, and somewhere, in the space between them, is the lesson that Helga and James carried for the rest of their lives. It is not the food that makes us human. It is what we do with it, how we share it, how we choose, even in hunger, even in war, to see the person across from us not as an enemy, but as someone who also needs to eat. That is the lesson of the can. That is the story of the camp. That is the truth that survives when everything else has turned to dust.